Welcome back to Built to Ship, the podcast where we go behind the scenes with founders and product leaders, shipping real AI products into the world. I'm your host, Tyler Postal from Voker, and today I'm excited to be joined by Devin, co-founder of Dosu, an AI-powered engineering teammate that helps teams automate documentation, issue triage, and code maintenance workflows. Devin, I'm sure you can explain much more, but it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tyler. Super excited to chat.
Awesome. Well, why don't we start with your background and the founding story? What were you doing before Dosu? How'd you come up with the idea? Let's go from there.
100%. So, in terms of my background, I am an engineer by trade. And so I have been in startups for about 8 years now. I was a first engineer at a startup, and then a second engineer in another startup, and ended up leading engineering there after a few years. And at that last startup, we were building a machine learning platform in the automotive space. So, more traditional AI, pre LLMs. But while I was there, I was pretty fortunate to get early exposure to GPT-3. We had someone on the team with early access. I really like building stuff on the side generally. Like I love to code. And so I started fine-tuning models. In that case, GPT-3, you had like the Da Vinci, Curie, Babbage, all these different like models that you could fine-tune. And so I was fine-tuning it for various use cases and side project. And I was an early user of GitHub Copilot, really fell in love with LLMs for developer tooling space. And when GPT-4 came out, if you can think back to then, there was this, excitement about are LLMs going to automate software engineering? And it's actually amazing kind of thinking from there to now in just a few years, how far we've come. But I felt back then, and to extent still today, there was a lot of dialogue about talking about software engineering as coding. But when I thought about my job as a developer, once I became pretty proficient software developer, coding was no longer really the bottleneck for me, or really where I spent most of my time. It was more around code understanding, and then importantly, sharing my understanding. So whether that is answering questions from other engineers or non-technical teammates, like code is source of truth for how your product actually works and evolves over time. And I was always the shortest path to information at the companies I worked at. And so I started Dosu with this idea of like, okay, can we make engineering knowledge more broadly accessible with LLMs, where it's not just the person who built the feature that can answer the questions or help you debug, but that information is more accessible both to engineering and non-technical personas. And that was the, I guess, beginning. And Dosu's evolved a lot since then, and so has the space. So yeah, we can get into that.
Amazing. Yeah, I think generally people don't love writing documentation, right? But it is very valuable. And I like also that you mentioned, and I'm curious to dig into this too later, the non-technical persona or the non-engineers having access, because that's also, sure, you get the like junior developers asking you like, oh, how does this work? I read through the code, but I don't understand it. But probably even tougher to explain and more frequent is the question from the business folks of like, hey, how does this work when someone does X? And then that really requires, like, the junior dev can read through the code, but like, a business person can't. So yeah, that's a pretty exciting value prop.
Yeah, exactly. And like, documentation, the way we like to think about it, especially in the more AI first world, it's essentially like a knowledge cache. Some engineer put the thought into building something, researching something, and then they condensed and wrote their learnings into a document that is then consumable for other people, so they don't have to do that same kind of investigation. And so the way we like to think about docs in the AI first world is really just bringing down the friction of capturing like human intent and learnings, and saving those, and then actually keeping those up to date and making sure they're reliable.
Amazing. So, I mean, you kind of alluded to it, but what are the personas or the size of company that you're building Dosu for, and what's a core example of how the product's used by these customers?
Yeah, so there are a few different personas of like ways people find and use Dosu. So I'll speak first to kind of the business use case, and then I'll get into kind of more actually where we started. So for teams, Dosu is very popular with, I would describe as AI forward teams. And so if you are a heavy user of Cloud Code Cursor internally, documentation and like internal context is sort of like a superpower for those agents, because they don't have to do as much grepping through the code base if they have docs that point them to the right place about how certain product features work or how they're implemented. And same thing for like, capturing learnings that you're having with coding agents, and making sure that those are written down, so then they don't have to be repeated across teams. Like, one way to think about agents is, you're onboarding an engineer every time you interact with it. And onboarding is a really common use case for documentation. So Dosu is very popular for like AI forward teams of all sizes, but typically once you're having to collaborate across teams. So, usually we see, like customers around like 50 employees to thousands. And then also typically, like going to that non-technical persona, the other side of it are businesses that are more logistically complex or operationally complex. And so whether it's healthcare, logistics, marketplaces, something to do with the physical world, wherever you have a lot of ops people or business people that are not engineers, they are constantly needing information about how does their system work? Is it compliant? Are we, handling this weird edge case for this state correctly? And so Dosu is a really popular way to make sure that that information is accessible to the broader org. And so that's on the business side. And then, the way a lot of people actually know about Dosu is through our work in open source. So Dosu, when we started, and still is today, I think the most popular tool for helping with issue triage in open source.
Wow.
Basically answering questions and triaging issues on, GitHub. And so if you haven't, run into Dosu, people always do. Basically, you're Googling your problem, you're ChatGPTing your problem. It ends up on GitHub issues, and if we're installed in that project, you'll likely see Dosu responding, and then that's how people check us out. So, maintainers use us to help lighten the load on the issue triage side as well as the documentation side, and then individual developers usually just run into us in open source.
That's really cool. That's a pretty unique distribution channel and great for your awareness. So that's awesome. And I think like this is an example of, where AI and companies like you guys can disrupt. It's not just that you're automating something that engineers were already doing, like the documentation. I think the transformation is that now also you're thinking about business users. I think very rarely were people thinking about how is a business user going to read this documentation and code. That they're not going to, right? And now they have access to that. Let's get into some of the like core AI features of the product. Obviously this is an AI native tool. What are the different functions? Do you call them different agents, or how would you describe the AI parts of your product?
Where to begin? So as an AI, I guess forward company, most things we do is AI related. I'll talk about like kind of the Dosu agent architecture at a high level. The way we, think about our agent is we do have, I guess, many different agents. But when people interact with Dosu, you'll either do it through automated workflows. So you open a PR and Dosu will review that with respect to your knowledge base. Or like people will reach out and ask Dosu questions. So whether that's through chat or through MCP increasingly. And in the case where users are reaching out, we have a orchestrator agent as like the top level agent that people are going to interface with. And then that orchestrator is going to delegate to tools and sub agents it has access to. So for the instance of question answering, we have a dedicated research agent that actually also has a bunch of sub agents specializing in code changes, for understanding pull requests and how the project's evolved over time, code, exploring the code base, looking through your connected documentation sources, as well as conversations. So looking through Slack, Microsoft Teams, etc., for related conversations. And so there's a bit of a delegation chain where we go from orchestrator to then a research agent and then corresponding sub agents for question answering. But then if you ask Dosu like, hey, can you actually write a document about this or save this thread to our knowledge base, that's going to kick off a different sub agent for either generating, like writing new knowledge, or updating, so helping you manage your knowledge.
Awesome. How do you think about where the cutoff should be between these agents? Like, is that something you're still figuring out? Is it a really clear boundary of like, nope, this is research now, it needs to be a different agent?
I think it's still something we are figuring out. It's not super clear cut. I mean, I think the pattern that has emerged that we found very, is we found pretty successful internally, and I think you see a lot with other companies talking about the same, is at least on like the sub agents are a very effective way to manage context, especially for a workflow where we're generating documentation. Like it can take up to 30 minutes, 45 minutes for like really complex projects. And in that case, context management is really important. And if you're just using just raw tool calls from the main top level agent, you're going to fill up that context window really, really fast. And so the nice thing about sub agents, especially on the search side, is it basically helps you keep your main agent's context pretty clean, where it's only going to get information back that's relevant. And so if you're fortunate enough to have a UX paradigm where latency isn't as much of an issue, I think the sub agent pattern is usually the way to go. And then it's a question of like, when do you kind of break that down? Like, should the top level orchestrator also have access to the same tools as the sub agents, or should it only see those sub agents? And that's something that we've been playing with. Right now, the way we do it is you can think of it as like the orchestrator has access to read the information that is returned from the sub agents, and but doesn't have access to the exact same tool set. So if it gets information back, it can explore those results more in more detail, but it doesn't have the exact same tool set as the sub agent.
Very, very interesting and very helpful that you're sharing like these learnings that you guys have probably spent a ton of time, testing and figuring out. How are you managing? Like, this sounds like a pretty complex system, multiple sub agents, etc. You mentioned orchestration as an agent at one point, but like, do you use a framework for managing agents? And I'm also curious, like, are you using Vercel SDK? Do you do direct calls to providers? Do you use something like Open Router? Like, what have you found to be the best way to manage this like increasingly complex system?
This is something we have spent a lot of time on. I think something that's kind of fun and both fun and frustrating about building Dosu is we were fairly early to the space. And so when I first started and I built our first agent, I was optimizing everything around between 2K, 4K context windows.
Wow.
And so and like so much of our code was around context management. And after about say a year of Dosu, context windows actually weren't as much of an issue. And so we then had to redo our agent to we concerned about context length, but much less so. And so we kind of rewrote our agent with everything from scratch. We evaluated tools at the time. This was like a year ago, and we felt like nothing was mature enough, and the landscape was changing too much that we didn't want to adopt anything. So we built our own sort of workflow orchestration system internally, just using also building our own wrappers around different model providers. And that worked really well. It gave us a ton of control over how we wanted to direct Dosu's research. It helped us bake in a lot of our learnings about the nuances of the types of questions and requests that users are asking. And then fast forward another year, especially I would say the past 6 months, the foundation model providers have invested so much in fine tuning on this agent tool calling loop that we actually found that all the scaffolding and custom tooling we built was actually kind of putting the model in too much of a box. We didn't have the infrastructure to like let the model shine as much. And so we have now since transitioned to Pydantic AI as our framework, where
Nice.
it is all like agent and tool calling based, very much mimicking how any kind of Claude code type of tool will work. And we ended up choosing Pydantic. We evaluated a lot of frameworks. We ended up choosing Pydantic because I felt like it was the least opinionated. It had like the minimal subset of features needed to implement most use cases, but it didn't, add features for the sake of adding features. It was a very good foundation. I generally liked their APIs where it's async first, but it's also very friendly to running things synchronously if you want, because for those building in Python, async IO can always be a fuck gun as well. I also really like the OpenAI's agents SDK. At least they're like API specs, like kind of like their interface they expose. But I felt like the Pydantic community was much stronger and more likely to be vendor neutral, which is definitely important for us.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's what you're explaining is a challenge of being early. You're working with what tools you have, and oftentimes you have to build things in house, and then you're ahead, but then you also have to eventually keep up with the technology, and just being able and willing to like say, okay, we're going to scrap this and we're going to start using a new framework. It's a tough decision, but it's what happens when the industry is moving so quickly and the tech's changing. You mentioned like the scale of Dosu, the fact that you're used across all sorts of open source projects, you have all these sub agents. How do you actually keep track of, you have agents in production everywhere. How do you keep track of how they're doing? How do you monitor performance? How much do you rely on like users telling you something's wrong versus you keeping track of that proactively?
So a lot of different things. I'll break this down. I guess one is like general monitoring, and then more on like the evaluation performance side. For general monitoring, something that we found and the tool we've been, I guess, pretty excited about is actually not necessarily related to agents, but is a durable execution framework called DBOS, DBOS, and it's a Postgres back sort of a like temporal competitor, if you're familiar with temporal cadence from like the durable execution world. But what's nice about DBOS, if you're a Postgres shop like us, it is very easy and lightweight to adopt. And what you essentially get out of the box out of it is durability. And so you can have these long running agents where you can have like policies if like the server's restarted. If it goes down, like the workflow will eventually succeed if you can define it as such. But also because everything's logged to Postgres, you get really good monitoring about like where's our agent spending a lot of time, which steps are taking too long, if it's running into an error, what happened, what was the input, all that gets captured in the database. And you can get some of that from tracing providers, but we find it's harder to pull that information out versus like if it's in Postgres where we have a bunch of tooling to pull, query that directly already. So we really become fans with that and all of our agents. They have a good Pydantic AI integration. We built a lot of custom tooling around that. So that gives us good visibility into like just high level, what's going on, where are things failing, what steps are most likely to fail. And then on the tracing side, we also use Langsmith. We've been using them for a very long time and pretty happy with kind of like the tracing functionality there, where really, we go to Langsmith when we want to investigate, for a specific run, like what happened. It's more of a deep dive tool rather than a kind of high level overview. At least that's how we treat it. And then outside of that, one of the things that we're pretty fortunate on, especially on the response side of Dosu, is that Dosu is typically used in public forums. And what I mean by that is like GitHub issues. There's many users participating, not just Dosu. And they're usually real problems. And so there's an eventual resolution. And so we get a lot of signal from, hey, even if Dosu wasn't right, what was the right answer, like the eventual solution. And that allows us to build some cool tooling where maybe we don't actually post our response to this thread, but then we compare it to the ultimate resolution and we get some signal there. It also means we can get sentiment from like the broader thread. And then we also, rely on reactions as many people still do for just like high level, how are we doing? But at the end of the day, I think you probably have heard this from everyone. It's like you really just have to spend a lot of time looking at the data because what's nice is that we've come a long way where building agents some of the infrastructure has gotten easier, but really like the long tail of understanding where it's going to fail just takes time, and is a lot of careful, like, combing through traces.
Definitely. Yeah. Hear that a lot. I think what is unique is, the way that you're using, the Postgres tool. I forget what it was called again.
DBoss.
DBoss. Yeah. And I'm curious. So it makes sense now that you store that data there, it's a lot easier to write a SQL query. Then I assume the struggle with the tracing tool is like, how do you export it? And then how do you query on top of it? And, they're not built for insights or, analysis at a high level. How do you use DBoss? Do you just like literally every time you have a question, you have to write a query of like, okay, select star from whatever, or do you have like some other BI tool on top of, the database itself?
Yeah, we built a bunch of really cool like Grafana dashboards and tooling on top of it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I could keep asking you questions all day. This has been fascinating, and really appreciate you sharing like, everything from, the struggles, what's going well, and then also listing out actual tools that you guys use. That's really generous and helpful for all folks that are listening. I want to put Dosu's website up on the screen. I'm sure lots of folks have already heard of you guys, but for those who haven't, who should use Dosu? Where should they follow along? How do they learn more?
Yeah, I think increasingly a big focus for us is on the MCP and agent side, right? Like more and more, the consumer of internal knowledge is agents, and so whether you are adopting agents internally and are spending too much time handcrafting either documentation for it, agents.md, thinking about what does it mean to like manage and create skills, would love to talk to you. Separately, if you are just a developer, working on any project and are trying to bring in context from kind of open source and other dependencies, like follow along. We're going to be doing a lot of work, kind of connecting our open source work back to individual developers over the next few months.
Amazing. And that sounds like a bit of a teaser. So what would you say is like, anything else for folks to look forward to, or any timelines you want to share around like what's next coming up for Dosu?
I won't give timelines. I think something that, in terms of what's next, and I think really interesting is, we've been very focused on the read side of like MCP and documentation and knowledge, but now more and more software is being written by agents, and we're thinking a lot about what does the right side of Dosu look like for agents. When they want to make a decision, or maybe you have an interaction with your correction or something. What does that it look like to write documentation and maintain knowledge when building with agents? So
very cool. Yeah, that's exciting. Looking forward to seeing what you guys come out with. Thanks again, Devin, for joining, and it was great having you on the pod. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tyler. This was really fun.
Awesome. See you later.